Go back to the Global Fund Manager Survey again. Owing to optimism in China, there's a big jump in optimism in China because China is reopening. And actually, if you read it here, Fund Manager Survey optimism on China growth surged to a net 75%. Now see a stronger Chinese economy in 23, up from a net 13%. That's the percentage of better, stronger. Net 75 from 13% in September, in November. Most positive outlook since May of 21, and the biggest month-over-month increase since January 20th. The majority expect China to fully reopen by the end of 23. Okay, China ended zero COVID. China has a terrible COVID infection rate now, but everybody knows that's going to end, and it's going to end in a couple of months, and then China is going to reopen. So you can see this in the forecasts from economists of Chinese growth. Chinese growth is expected to be somewhere at around 3% for this year, but then it's supposed to rebound to somewhere near 5% next year. This is the 2022-2023 forecast for growth. And you can see zero COVID really took its damage on China. By the way, 3% is where we're at right now on the actual number. And that is, other than the lockdowns, one of the lowest numbers since the 1970s. The economy in China, I used to say, a lot of people used to say the definition of a recession in China was anything under 7% growth. Well, they're 3 right now. And even in Tiananmen Square, the financial crisis or the global financial crisis, they had higher growth rates then than they have right now. The damage that zero COVID did to their economy cannot be overestimated. And so since we've got all of this damage from zero COVID on their economy, everybody's expecting that now that it's lifted, I might add, I believe they're making the same mistake about China that they made about the US. So here's passenger volume of all of these cities. This is mass transit passenger volume updated through Tuesday. And 28 million people are riding subways in the big 12 cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangdong, Shenzhen, all the big cities are on this. It used to be 40 to 41 million is fully reopened. They're at 28. Golden Week is next week, or the lunar New Year is next week. This number will go back down for the Lunar New Year because everybody goes on vacation and then it'll pop back up. The mistake that everybody's making is, oh, China's going to go back to 41 million people riding the subway for the rest of the year. And that means 2019. Everybody's going to go back, and I'll say this bluntly to get my point across. The blood has been, 40 people were beaten on the floor of the Foxconn factory where they make the iPhone 14. They've cleaned it up, mopped up all the blood. They're just going to go right back. Foxconn is trying to tell us that it's going to look exactly like 2019 in about a month or two there, as if nothing happened. Never mind the fact, let me just put you, I'm in the Peter Zeihan camp that China is in a world of trouble, that in the next several years, I think they're going to do nothing short of falling apart. And Xi, being effectively elected for life, is going to do what he did last month. Last month, the Chinese lockdowns were not lockdowns, were not people saying, please let me go back to that job at the iPhone factory. By the way, it takes 200,000 people to make iPhones because it's not automated. The worker rights there are non-existent. Some of the jobs are dangerous, breathing terrible chemicals, physical labor that inspires injury and the like as well. And that what happened was, after the beatings and everything, about a third of the workforce quit, just left. And they've rehired 40 or 50,000 people to do these jobs. They've only been trained for a month or two. A lot of these jobs are very menial task jobs. But what those protests were was not, let me go back to work. They were, and I'll hold this up, white paper revolutions. They were asking for democracy. They were asking for the CCP and Xi to resign. They were asking for an end of censorship. And what happened to most of the organizers of those protests? They've disappeared. Nobody knows where they are. They just stop answering the phone and no one's heard from them. And so that's why I'm in the Peter Zeihan camp, that China has got nothing but problems. And over the next several years, it gets worse for them. It doesn't get better because Xi is not going to let go. More people are just going to keep disappearing that push back on this guy. You saw them Xin Tao, the prime minister, like something out of a mobster movie, was escorted out of the National Congress in October. This is what's going to happen. He is going to run this economy the way that Xi feels that he needs to run it. And anybody who questions him, you're going to disappear too. Now, here's the problem. What happens when you have a brutal dictator like that? Everybody tells him what he wants to hear. And what has Xi consistently done for the last several years? Every instinct, every policy has made things worse. Zero COVID made it worse. What's the worst possible way to get rid of zero COVID? Let it rip as well. And this is what's going to continue. If you think people are going to push back on Xi and tell them bad policy, you should do this, you disappear too. So he's going to do nothing but make one bad mistake after another after another. He has been. He is the architect of the worst Chinese economy in nearly 50 years. It is not going to change anything more than that. Now, last thing I'll say about China is, will these numbers for transit go up? Yes. Wall Street wants you to believe that means that buy raw materials, industrial metals, energy, because they're going to suck all that up into the factory of the world. And out the other side is going to be a bunch of finished goods to help depress inflation, to get Fed to pivot, to get the stock market going to 5,000, get in bonds to be the best investment, and Jay to realize what a terrible mistake he's made. The last chart I'll show you is subway traffic in Chicago, San Francisco, and New York. It has only recovered to about 2/3 of where it was. Remote work, hybrid work. There's been, every pandemic produces a fundamental change in the way that people think, in the way that people act. This one is no different in the West, in the United States. Remote work, hybrid work is the result of it. I don't think that China is just going to say, get the playbook out. How did things work in 2019? It's going to be exactly like that in 2019. Yes, people will get on the subway and get out of their house and go do things. But if it's going to be to produce an abundance of stuff to depress our inflation rate like they did from 2010 to 2019, cheap stuff in abundance just coming out of China forever, to keep the inflation rate, so Fed could cut rates to zero, they could stop worrying about inflation, and we could keep buying 25 forward PE ratio stocks forever because they only go up. If that's, I think that's what Wall Street wants to believe is going to happen. Yes, people are going to get out of the house. Yes, there's going to be reopening, but it's going to be kind of like the reopening in the West. It's not going to be the same thing. It's not a return to 2019. I'm not going to tell you what I know what it's going to be. I'll just also throw out that China knows Cam Harvey's arguments about the yield curve. China sees the forecast for a global slowdown. Why are we going to ramp everything up to 100% when right into the teeth of a slowdown? So I think that this China reopening is not going to go the way people are. Yes, they reopen. Yes, they recover. But you've got a guy that either you agree with Xi or you disappear, and has made one colossally bad mistake after another, between the property bubble, between the stimulus, between the crackdown on companies, taking Jack Ma's company Alibaba away from him, which is official as of last week, to zero COVID, to reopening zero COVID. Everything he does is a mistake because no one will challenge him at all. He is the dictator for life, and you either agree with him and think that everything out of his mouth is brilliance and you follow through on what he says, or you're gone. And he has nobody telling him what is really happening in his country. And that's why he makes one mistake after another. And that's why I think China is going to peak at a lower level, and it's only going to get worse unless the Chinese people rise up in some version of Tiananmen Square and push him out. But we'll see. So I'm like Peter Zion, I am very pessimistic about the outlook for China moving forward for the next several years. And that doesn't even get into the terrible demographics, the other disastrous thing that might just create havoc in China for the next generation was the one-child policy. Their demographics are terrible. Their workforce is way too many men, not enough women. They can't get married. That is not a good cocktail. They can't support the number of people that are retiring, onward and onward and onward. You know, so that's another problem as well too.